I had always thought of the woods as a sanctuary, a place where the mind could finally unclench, where the chatter of the world faded into the rhythm of rustling leaves and distant streams. My name is David. I'm 32, and I've spent more nights under canvas in the wilds of California than in my own apartment. That August in 2022, I decided to take a solo trip to Yosemite National Park, craving solitude, maybe a little danger, and the kind of peace that only the high Sierra could offer. I chose a small, secluded campsite tucked away behind a ridge that, according to the ranger's map, saw little traffic. The sun had just begun its slow descent behind El Capitan when I pitched my tent, its olive canvas blending almost perfectly with the surrounding pines. The air was crisp, carrying the faint smell of pine sap and cold earth. I unpacked my bag, arranged the essentials: water, a flashlight, a small first aid kit, and my notebook, and settled in, unaware that the night had already begun stitching threads of unease into the forest around me. At first, the sounds were familiar, comforting even, the occasional bird calling, the whisper of wind through the branches, the faint trickle of a distant creek. But as darkness deepened, the familiar rhythm shifted. There was a footstep, or so I thought, soft, deliberate, measured, not the random snap of a twig under a wandering deer's hoof. I froze, heart catching in my chest, straining to hear. Another step, and then another, echoing around the perimeter of my tent. My rational mind told me it was likely another camper, or perhaps a ranger doing a late patrol, but the park's map had made it clear. I was alone. My pulse quickened, but I reminded myself that panic would only cloud judgment. I grabbed my flashlight, its beam cutting a narrow path into the inky darkness, and unzipped the tent just enough to peer out. The forest stared back, indifferent and silent, as though the trees themselves were holding their breath. No one. Nothing. Yet the steps had sounded so close, circling, almost deliberate, as if the forest were rearranging itself around me. The minutes stretched unbearably, and then came the softest rustle. Different this time. Lighter, almost like fabric brushing against leaves. I held my breath, every nerve taut, every instinct screaming. I thought about the locals I had spoken to earlier that day, old park rangers and hikers who warned about strange occurrences in Yosemite after dark. They told stories of hikers hearing whispers where no one was, tents shaking in empty campsites, shadows that didn't belong. I never believed them, not until this moment. And then came the sound that made my stomach drop. A faint, deliberate scrape, like claws or maybe heavy boots, moving against the earth around my tent. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. I just listened, straining for any pattern, any sign of what or who was out there. The forest seemed alive in a way I had never noticed before, a living, breathing entity that knew I was trespassing in its heart. I gripped my flashlight tighter and slowly unzipped the tent further, enough to see just a sliver of the world beyond. Shadows danced in the narrow beam, but there was no form, no figure, nothing that could be identified. And yet the steps continued, faint but undeniably close, tracing a circuit around my small refuge. Every instinct screamed to flee, to run, to abandon the site entirely, but the thought of moving blindly through these ancient woods in near darkness terrified me almost as much as whatever haunted my campsite. I sat down, tried to calm my shaking hands, and whispered to myself, "Just observe. Don't react. Stay quiet." The sound of my own voice startled me with its vulnerability in the vast, indifferent wilderness. Hours seemed to pass, or maybe minutes, but the tension stretched into something unquantifiable, a liminal space where time and fear merged. I remembered a trick from my early days hiking with friends. If you pretend to ignore a presence, it sometimes dissipates. I tried to convince myself that I was imagining things, that every sound was the forest itself conspiring with my imagination. But then, unmistakably, there came a pause in the footsteps, and I knew immediately that whatever had been circling my tent had stopped just beyond the reach of my light. Silence became oppressive, every rustle amplified, every distant howl of a coyote a potential signal. I couldn't see them, couldn't even confirm their presence, but my senses told me I was being watched, studied, as if the forest had a memory of trespassers, and I had been logged in its quiet ledger. I made the decision to face it, not in the bravado of youth, but in the calculated resolve of survival. Slowly, I unzipped the tent fully and stepped out, flashlight cutting a cone of light ahead. The forest stretched infinitely, trees lining the slope like sentinels. I took a careful step forward, then another, ears straining, and then I saw it. Not a person, not an animal, but an impression, a disturbance in the leaf litter, circling and recircling my campsite. Every step I had imagined, every fear I had conjured, found its echo here, in the pattern of footprints left behind, heavy, deliberate, human-like, yet strangely unplaceable. They circled my tent, but stopped short at every tree, as if the forest had guided whoever or whatever was moving around me. And in that moment, fear became knowledge. This was no mere camper, no lost hiker. This was something different, something intimately tied to the night itself. I spent the rest of that night in a state of hyper-awareness, alternating between watching the shadows and attempting brief rest, never fully closing my eyes. The forest hummed, alive with secrets and old stories, a place that held centuries of human presence and absence alike. As dawn broke, painting the pines in soft gold and the sky in tender pinks and blues, the footsteps ceased. Nothing remained but the disturbed ground, the evidence of a presence that may have been real, or a hallucination conjured by isolation, stress, and darkness. I packed my campsite with hands still trembling, every sound of the morning amplified, yet strangely reassuring. I left Yosemite that day with an understanding deeper than any map or ranger's briefing could offer. The forest is alive not only in its flora and fauna, but in memory, in shadows, in the quiet ways it tests those who enter its heart. By the time I reached the main trail, sunlight warming my shoulders, I realized the lesson embedded in fear itself. It teaches patience, awareness, and humility. There's a kind of courage in facing what cannot be controlled, and an even deeper wisdom in accepting that not every mystery needs to be solved. That night in Yosemite, I learned that the forest is a living entity, one that measures intentions, reads the heart, and remembers those who pass through its quiet corridors. The footsteps around my tent were not simply a brush with danger. They were an encounter with the profound, the inexplicable, a reminder that some parts of the world exist beyond human comprehension, and that respect, caution, and attentiveness are not just virtues, but survival tools. As I drove away, the mountains receding in my rearview mirror, I knew I would return, not to challenge the woods, but to listen to them, to understand them in ways that only those who have felt fear in the silent embrace of ancient trees can truly grasp. The first thing I noticed was the silence, not the kind of silence you get in a city at midnight, heavy with neon and traffic, but the silence that presses against your bones when you step into the deep, old forests of Acadia. My name is Daniel, I'm 28, and I've spent nearly half my life chasing the kind of solitude only found where the pines grow dense and the wind has nowhere to go but to whisper between the trunks. That September, I was drawn to a narrow ridge near Jordan Pond, hoping to escape the world, to breathe something older and wilder than the pavement I walked every day. What I didn't expect was that the forest would breathe back. The campsite was modest, a clearing carved between twisted pines with a small, mossy rock I used as a table, and a stream nearby that sang in a voice both gentle and relentless. I'd arrived late, the sun dropping behind the mountains in streaks of orange and violet, the mist curling like smoke through the low branches. I remember setting up my tent with a strange, anticipatory tension, feeling like I wasn't alone, but dismissing it as the thrill of isolation. It's easy to convince yourself you're prepared. It's another thing entirely to discover that preparation can't shield you from what the woods hold. The first hint that something was off came as twilight thickened. I was cooking a small meal, the scent of sizzling bacon mingling with pine resin, when I heard it, a subtle rustling, like steps brushing against dead leaves. At first, I thought it was a deer, or a raccoon, maybe. But the movement had a cadence too deliberate, too measured, as if someone or something was pacing just beyond the tree line, watching. My pulse quickened, but I told myself I was imagining it. Rational thought is a fragile companion when your senses insist otherwise. As night fell, the forest transformed. Shadows stretched like fingers across my tent, the moonlight slicing through the branches in thin silver knives. I tried to sleep, telling myself the rustling had been the wind, the weight on my chest just nerves. But then the whispers began, not loud, not clear, but a pattern of exhaled syllables that carried through the cold air, brushing against the corners of my mind. I froze, listening. The whispers didn't form words I could recognize, yet they had intent. They wanted me to know I was being watched. I stayed perfectly still, imagining every possible explanation, hoping it was my own fear turned tangible. By midnight, the air was damp, heavy with fog, curling like smoke around the trunks. I had decided to investigate. Taking my flashlight, I stepped out of the tent, and the forest seemed to inhale with me. Every step on the soft pine needles felt amplified, every crack of a twig a warning. I scanned the shadows, heart hammering, and for a moment, the world felt impossibly vast. And then I saw it. A pair of eyes, reflecting faintly in the beam of my light, far across the clearing but unmistakably fixed on me. They weren't deer eyes, not fox eyes. There was an intelligence there, an awareness that made my stomach knot. I froze, rooted in place, unsure whether to retreat or confront. I returned to my tent. The image of those eyes burned behind my eyelids. Sleep became impossible, the darkness now a tangible pressure. Every creak, every snap of a branch made me flinch. I thought of turning on my phone, calling someone, but there is no service on that ridge. The forest swallows signals the same way it swallows light. Hours passed like days, and I found myself talking to the shadows, pleading, bargaining, trying to assert control over something I couldn't name. And in those long hours, I realized fear in the forest isn't a creature or a sound. It's the realization that the world you know isn't the only one that exists. As dawn began to bleed into the sky, the mist lifted in layers, revealing the ridge and the distant waters of Jordan Pond. I left the tent standing, belongings packed in a trembling hurry, retracing my steps along the narrow trail down the mountain. And yet, even in retreat, I sensed I had learned something essential. The forest has a rhythm that doesn't bend to human expectations. Its lessons are hard, visceral, and unrelenting. In the days that followed, I returned to Acadia, again and again, carrying the memory of those eyes, letting them teach me patience, respect, and the courage to face the unknown without succumbing to panic. I would tell you that the forest taught me to be fearless, but that would be a lie. Fear never left me. It lives in the pulse of the pines, in the sigh of the fog, in the way shadows gather at the edge of your vision. What I learned is more subtle. That courage is not the absence of fear, but the decision to move forward, to step lightly, to observe, and to acknowledge that you are just one story among countless others in the vast, indifferent woods. Acadia did not want to harm me. It wanted to remind me that every step I take here is borrowed, and every breath is a lesson. By the end of that September, I began to understand why locals speak of the unseen eyes in hushed tones. They are not monsters or myths. They are the forest itself, sentient in its patience, invisible but never absent, teaching vigilance, humility, and a kind of reverence that no campsite guide or survival manual could convey. Every camper who ventures into these depths carries a story, and sometimes those stories linger long after the tent is packed away and the trailhead fades behind you. I left Acadia with more than photographs and gear. I left with an awareness that solitude in the woods is never truly solitary, that the land remembers every step, every choice, and that fear, carefully faced, can become the clearest lens through which to understand yourself. I continued down the winding trail, the morning mist still clinging to my boots, each step heavier than the last, as if the forest itself was reluctant to release me. I could feel it behind me, not in sight, but in the way the air shifted, the way a branch would quiver just before the wind caught it. By midday, I reached a small creek, its waters running clear and indifferent, and I paused to drink, shaking with exhaustion. And then I saw them again. Faint, almost imperceptible tracks pressed into the soft soil, too large for any animal I knew, moving in parallel lines as though someone or something had been walking with me all along, careful to match my pace without ever closing in. I swallowed hard. My mind tried to rationalize. Maybe hikers from the night before, maybe deer dragging their hooves, but the spacing, the symmetry, the precision, it was wrong. It was deliberate. I pressed on, heart pounding, each footfall a drum beat in the dense silence. Shadows lengthened, folding over the rocks and roots like living fabric, and I realized I was no longer just being watched. I was being studied, cataloged, understood. There is a certain horror in that, when the world you thought was empty is not, when the pines are not just trees but sentinels, recording every misstep, every glance, every lapse in attention. I remembered the words of a local I had met on the first night. The forest sees more than you see. It remembers more than you know. At the time, I'd laughed nervously, imagining old myths told to scare tourists. But now, walking through the living cathedral of pines, I understood. Night fell again, faster than I expected, the sky dimming into a bruised gray. I had found a second, smaller clearing to rest. But sleep was impossible. The air was thick, almost viscous, carrying the faint scent of damp earth and something else. Something metallic, like iron. And then I heard it, a soft, deliberate tapping, as if someone were rapping their knuckles against a tree trunk just beyond the edge of light cast by my lantern. I froze, knowing that sound had no natural origin. My pulse slammed in my ears. Rational thought screamed, "It's the wind, it's a branch, it's a hallucination." But instinct, primal and ancient, screamed back, "Do not move." Hours passed in a haze of terror and awareness. The tapping ceased, but the forest didn't. The shadows lengthened and twisted, and I felt a presence behind me, something just outside the circle of light, never revealing itself, but close enough that I could feel the heat of it, the intelligence. I whispered into the night, asking, begging for it to leave me be. But silence answered. And in that silence, I understood. The forest is patient. It does not act out of cruelty. It simply observes. And in observation, there is power. By morning, I knew I could not linger. I packed silently, moving with a hyper-alert caution I had never known before. Every rustle, every bird call, every distant snap of a branch, a potential warning. As I descended toward the trailhead, I stumbled across a small carved symbol etched into the bark of a pine, crude yet unmistakably deliberate, a circle enclosing two eyes, staring outward. I shivered, certain now that I had crossed into a world that existed parallel to ours, one where the land is alive in ways that defy logic, and where visitors are not intruders. They are participants, their fear and respect measured, cataloged, and remembered. I left Acadia that September with a body exhausted but alive, and a mind irrevocably changed. The unseen eyes, the tapping, the tracks, they did not leave me once I returned to the roads and the cities. They haunt me in quiet moments, in the brush of wind against a window, in the way shadows fall across the living room floor. And yet, through that fear, through the near constant awareness of being observed, I discovered a clarity I had never known. To enter the deep woods is to confront your own vulnerabilities, your own assumptions, and to accept that control is an illusion. The forest gives no guarantees, offers no comfort, yet in that raw honesty it teaches more than any human instructor ever could. I returned home, but I returned with a new rhythm in my chest, a cadence tuned to the unseen, a respect for the silent watchers in the pines. I began to understand that every hiker, camper, or wanderer who ventures into these old forests carries a story etched into the very soil, every choice a lesson. The terror I felt was not punishment, it was instruction, an invitation to grow sharper, quieter, more observant, and profoundly aware that the world is far larger, far stranger, and far older than our fragile lives allow us to see. Even now, years later, I hear that tapping in the corner of my mind. I see the reflection of eyes in the periphery of my vision, a reminder that the woods never forget. But it is no longer a fear that paralyzes. It is a respect that moves me forward, an understanding that some lessons can only be learned when you step alone into the wild, when the wind whistles through the pines and the eyes that follow are patient, silent, and eternally watching. The forest does not forgive ignorance. It does not reward arrogance, but it transforms those who walk its paths with courage, with humility, with the acceptance that we are all just visitors, glimpsing a world older, stranger, and more alive than we ever imagined. The fog came quietly at first, slipping between the pines like a cautious visitor, curling around the trunks, brushing against the moss-covered rocks with a whisper so soft it almost felt imagined. My name is Ethan. I was 28 at the time, and I had always considered myself someone who understood the forest, someone who could read the wind and the patterns of the trees. That October in 2020, my friends and I decided to camp deep in Olympic National Park, far from the crowds and the beaten trails, seeking the kind of solitude that makes the forest feel alive in ways the city can never teach you. But solitude, as it turns out, is a double-edged blade. We set up our camp near a small ridge overlooking the Quinault River, where the mist clung to the water like spilled milk. At first, it was beautiful, ethereal even, the kind of fog that photographers chase and poets write about. But as night fell, the same fog that had seemed like a companion began to feel like a presence, deliberate in its movements, curling through the trees with intent. I noticed it first, a shadow slipping in the corner of my vision, always at the edge, never fully seen. My friends laughed it off at first, calling it the tricks of low light, the imagination run wild from too much wilderness and too little sleep. But I felt it differently, a weight pressing in, a subtle wrongness that gnawed at the edges of my confidence. By the second night, the fog had thickened, swallowing the trail markers, muffling the sounds of the river, even muting our own voices. That's when the shapes appeared, figures that didn't belong. I saw them at first as vague silhouettes, tall and hunched, moving just beyond the trees. I tried to rationalize, telling myself it was the way shadows stretch in fog, the effect of a flickering campfire. But there was a rhythm to their movements, a deliberate pacing that mirrored ours, always keeping distance but never disappearing. I felt my pulse quicken, not in panic at first, but in a rising, uneasy awareness that the forest was watching us with knowledge and perhaps with intention. I told myself to focus on what I knew, stay calm, stay inside the circle of our small campsite, light the fire, make noise. But when I stepped out for water, I saw it fully for the first time. A figure, taller than any human should be, standing among the ferns, the fog hugging its outline so perfectly it seemed carved from the mist itself. Its face, or the lack of one, was featureless, a void that reflected nothing. And then it moved. Slowly, deliberately, sidestepping behind the trunks, disappearing and reappearing like a living shadow. That's when fear stopped being theoretical. My logical mind scrambled for explanations. Elk? Bear? Rogue hikers? But there was no sound, no scent, nothing alive that could move like that. Only that silence, that dreadful patience, pressing against the walls of my awareness. We tried to sleep, but every crackle of the fire, every rustle of leaves, made us jump. I couldn't stop watching. The fog seemed to respond to our fear, thickening and thinning like breathing, as if it were aware that we had noticed. By morning, my friends admitted they had seen things too. Shapes shifting at the edge of the clearing, shadows moving against their vision. There was an unspoken agreement among us not to speak too loudly about it. Fear has a way of crystallizing when named, of giving shape to the unknown in ways that make it inevitable. We packed slowly, our hands trembling, glancing over our shoulders as the fog swallowed our trail. I learned then that some parts of the forest are not meant to be dominated or understood. They are meant to be experienced, and in experiencing them, we are humbled. Walking back down the trail, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were still being observed. Every step that crunched on fallen leaves was mirrored by a silence that pressed behind us. I caught glimpses of the figures again, always at a distance, always shrouded in that relentless fog. They never approached, never threatened in any traditional sense, but their persistence taught me a lesson more profound than any survival guide could. Fear is not only in the danger we can name, but in the subtle awareness that the world is larger and stranger than we are. There is a vigilance and intelligence in the wild that is patient, that watches, that waits. And sometimes it waits for us to realize that we are not alone in the places we believe we can control. By the time we emerged from the mist into clearer air, the forest behind us seemed almost innocent again. The fog reduced to a memory, a damp coolness that clung to the undergrowth. But I carried it with me, the lesson etched into my skin and my mind. Camping is not about conquering nature or about proving courage. It is about respect, about noticing the shapes that move at the edges of perception, about understanding that some mysteries are better approached with humility. The fog that followed us was not just mist. It was a teacher, a mirror of our own assumptions and fears, and a reminder that true wilderness is alive in ways that cannot be tamed. Even now, years later, when I close my eyes and think of Olympic National Park, I see the mist curling between the pines, and I feel the weight of those unseen figures following, patient and silent. There is a beauty in the forest that draws you in, yes, but there is also a darkness that tests you, shapes you, and leaves a part of itself with you forever. And perhaps that is the real gift of camping in the deep woods, not the thrill, not the solitude, but the profound awareness that you are alive, and that life in its rawest form is bigger, stranger, and more mysterious than you will ever fully know. The deeper I walked into the park that morning, leaving the ridge behind, I realized the fog had left a residue on me, not on my clothes, not on my skin, but on the way I perceived the forest. Every tree seemed to lean just slightly, as if trying to whisper secrets. Every bird call sounded like a warning, and the river, so jubilant and loud in daylight, seemed to carry the echo of something patient and watching beneath its surface. My friends spoke little, each absorbed in the same unshakable sense that something unseen had been close, so close that the line between imagination and reality blurred, leaving us suspended in a quiet dread that didn't dissipate with distance. We had entered the wilderness seeking freedom, but we had discovered restraint. Restraint imposed not by rules, not by terrain, but by the awareness that the forest itself held dominion. By midday, we reached a small clearing, and I decided to rest by a rock that jutted over a creek. As I sat, I felt a sudden shift in the air. The fog we had thought confined to the ridge seemed to coil around us again, subtle this time, almost imperceptible, brushing against my neck like a soft caress. My heartbeat quickened, not in fear exactly, but in recognition. The fog was here again, following, remembering. And then I saw it. Movement not quite human, not quite animal. One of the figures stepped from behind a thick alder, and this time I couldn't deny its form. It was tall, impossibly thin, and moved with an elegance that defied gravity, its head tilting as if studying us the way a scholar studies a specimen. My rational mind grasped for explanations, for a root in reality, but there was none. It didn't threaten, didn't charge. It simply existed, a being that had no right to be there in the ordinary rules of the world, and yet was, unmistakably. I remember the moment when I realized fear is not always loud or violent. Sometimes it is quiet, a slow tightening in the chest, a coiling in the stomach. It is the understanding that the universe contains things you cannot negotiate with, cannot reason with, cannot hope to conquer. And yet, in that same moment, I felt an odd clarity, a piercing lucidity that comes only when you are confronted with the inexplicable. The figure retreated, dissolving into the fog as if it had never been, leaving us in a silence so complete that the sound of our own breathing seemed intrusive. We didn't speak, none of us could. Words felt inadequate against what we had witnessed. As afternoon waned into evening, the fog thickened once more, drawing long spectral fingers over the undergrowth. Our route back was no longer a line on a map, but a labyrinth of shadows and uncertainty. The sun was already low, its pale light struggling to pierce the mist, and every step forward was a negotiation with doubt. My friends clung to my presence, perhaps unconsciously seeking a tether to someone still grounded in reason. But I was only as grounded as my own nerves allowed, and each time a shadow flickered at the corner of my eye, each time the fog thickened in a way that seemed unnatural, I had to confront the truth that the forest was vast, patient, and not bound by human perception or expectation. That night when we finally made camp in a small grove near a stream, the fog descended fully, swallowing the world around us. Our fire, though bright, seemed like a fragile defense against the pervasive whiteness. I lay awake, listening to the hush of the woods, aware of movements that could not belong to deer or raccoons. The figures returned, gliding at a distance, always observing, always just out of reach. I felt my resolve being tested, not my courage, but my understanding of reality itself. Each time I convinced myself I had imagined them, I caught another glimpse, a repetition, a confirmation that the forest was alive in ways I had only dared to read about in books, not experience firsthand. By the third day, the tension had evolved into a strange, disciplined vigilance. We moved slowly, deliberately, leaving no trace that might tempt curiosity, speaking only when necessary. I learned to notice the smallest cues, the way the fog shifted around certain trees, the way the underbrush seemed to part as if guiding or warning us. Fear became a tool, not a curse. It heightened my senses, made me aware of subtleties I had ignored in my eagerness to master the wilderness. I realized then that the true danger was not in the figures, not in the fog, but in underestimating the forest and overestimating ourselves. That lesson, more than any sighting, more than any scare, was the one I would carry forever. When we finally descended to the lower trails, where the fog thinned and sunlight returned, there was a strange sense of dislocation. The forest appeared ordinary again, yet nothing about me or my friends was unchanged. We had glimpsed a dimension of the woods that resisted human understanding. We had seen that some presences are patient, silent, and yet impossible to ignore. And as the Olympic wilderness opened into the broader park, the figures and the fog seemed to recede, but not vanish entirely. They had left something with us, a quiet, insistent knowledge that the forest watches, and that sometimes the only safe course is respect, awareness, and humility. Even now, whenever I return to campfires, to rivers, to trails in the Pacific Northwest, I feel the lingering awareness of that fog. I remember the way it moved, the shapes that emerged from it, the way fear transformed from something paralyzing into something instructive. The wilderness is not merely a place to escape, but a mirror of our limitations, our vulnerabilities, and our capacity for awe. The figures never harmed us, but they reshaped us. They taught us the subtle, haunting truth that to enter the wild is to consent to being changed, to confront the unknowable, and to accept that sometimes survival is not about fighting, but about observing, listening, and understanding the power of what cannot be controlled. That October in Olympic National Park remains the most profound experience of my life. The fog, the figures, the unrelenting hush of the trees, they are all with me still, etched into memory with a clarity that does not fade. I carry the lessons everywhere, that fear can teach, that vigilance can protect, that the world contains layers of mystery we may never fully comprehend. And above all, I carry the understanding that the forest is not just a collection of trees and trails, but a living entity with patience, awareness, and a power that humbles anyone who dares to venture too far into its depths. I've always believed that the woods tell the truth before people do, and on a warm June evening in 2022, I learned just how unforgiving that truth can be. My name is Daniel Rhodes, 33 years old, born and raised in the foothills outside Charlottesville, Virginia. I grew up hearing the distant sighs of the Blue Ridge, the rustle of the Shenandoah valleys, and the whispered warnings passed down by locals who knew that the mountains hold memories longer than human lifetimes. I wasn't a rookie hiker. I wasn't naive. But that night in Shenandoah National Park, on a trail I thought I understood better than my own backyard, something followed me, something that never showed its face, but made sure I heard it every step of the way. And it all began with a sound I'd never forget. A single, sharp whistle drifting through the trees when no one else was supposed to be out there. I'd gone into the park for a 2-day solo trip, carrying nothing more than my pack, a map worn soft at the edges, and the quiet confidence of a man who'd been walking these trails for more than 20 years. I'd planned to camp near Hughes River, just off the North Ridge Trail, a place where the water runs cold and fast even in the summer heat, and where the dark comes earlier than it should. Locals say that part of the forest is older, angrier, more watchful. I'd always laughed that off, brushing it aside as folk superstition, the kind every mountain town grows from. But the deeper I went that evening, the more I felt that strange, creeping sense that the woods were paying attention to me, the way a predator studies the movement of something smaller in its path. The first whistle came just after sunset, when the sky had melted into a deep violet and the forest floor was losing its colors by the minute. I'd stopped to tighten my pack straps when I heard it. High, thin, deliberate, not birdsong, not wind, not anything natural drifting in by accident. It came from somewhere behind me on the trail. But when I turned, I saw nothing except the silhouettes of massive oaks leaning into the fading light, their branches locked like arms above the trail. I waited, listening, feeling my heartbeat tick louder in my ears. Nothing followed, no footsteps, no shifting leaves, just the soft, steady hum of the night insects slowly taking over the soundscape. After a moment, I convinced myself it must have been some kind of bird call, though no bird I knew called out just once with that kind of precision. I kept walking, but the forest changed. The air got heavier, thicker with dew and the scent of wet moss. Darkness pooled faster between the trunks, and the silence between insect calls felt strangely stretched, as if the entire forest was inhaling, holding its breath. I've spent countless nights alone in the Appalachian woods, but this was the first time I felt as though something was matching my pace, staying just out of sight but never out of reach. The second whistle came about 15 minutes later, clearer this time, closer. It sliced through the stillness like a blade, sharp and intentional. This time I froze where I stood, gripping the straps of my pack so tightly the nylon bit into my palms. Again I turned, scanning the trail, the underbrush, the shadows clinging to the slope. I didn't see anyone, but the feeling that I was no longer alone settled into my spine and stayed there, coiled and patient. I tried calling out, "Hello? Anyone there?" My voice felt small against the immensity of the forest, swallowed before it could rise. No answer came, just the distant rush of the river. I waited, forcing myself to breathe slowly, to stay rational. People sometimes hiked late. Maybe someone was goofing around. Maybe a kid was trying to scare hikers. Maybe. There was a normal explanation. But the locals' voices came back to me then, the stories spoken quietly over diner tables or whispered at gas stations late at night. Stories about whistles in the woods that didn't belong to any person. Stories about something on the ridges mimicking human sounds to lure hikers off the trail. Stories I'd always brushed off. I walked faster. By the time I reached the small clearing I'd chosen for my campsite, the sky was fully dark, the last threads of daylight choking out behind the mountains. I moved quickly, almost frantically, pitching my tent, gathering fallen branches, setting up my small fire with the urgency of someone trying to outrun a thought. But even as the flames caught and crackled to life, throwing warm light across the clearing, the tension in my chest didn't loosen. I kept glancing toward the tree line, half expecting something, anything, to be standing there watching. When the third whistle came, I dropped the piece of firewood I was holding. It came from the left side of the clearing, low and almost playful, like someone signaling a friend. But it wasn't just the proximity that terrified me. It was the tone. Too human, too calm, too deliberate, as if whoever or whatever was making it wanted me to know it was there, wanted me to feel its presence, wanted me to understand that this was no accident. I backed toward my tent slowly, my breathing ragged, my eyes struggling to pierce the darkness beneath the clustered pines. The fire popped sharply behind me, the sudden sound making me jump. My mind raced, my instincts screaming to run, to leave the gear behind and sprint toward the trailhead. But logic held me still. Running at night, alone on uneven terrain, that was how people disappeared. So I stood in the firelight, forcing my voice to stay steady as I spoke into the dark. If someone's out there, this isn't funny. Silence. Then leaves shifted, just once. A single step, heavy, controlled. My skin tightened. That was no deer, no small animal. That was the calculated weight of something or someone large enough to mean trouble. The fire crackled again, and in that flickering light I could see just enough of the forest edge to make out the suggestion of movement. Something low to the ground, then still, waiting, watching. I should have left then, packed up, abandoned the plan, and hiked back out with nothing but moonlight to guide me. But pride is a dangerous thing in the wilderness. It convinces you you're safer than you are. It tells you fear is weakness. And a man who grows up in these mountains is taught not to run from shadows. I stayed. I tried to eat, but every bite felt forced. The forest listened. That's what unnerved me most. The woods didn't breathe or shift the way they normally do. They watched, quietly, intensely, as if something within them had silenced everything else. And then, sometime around midnight, when the fire had burned down to a slow, pulsing glow, the fourth whistle echoed through the trees. This one wasn't close. It wasn't far. It came from everywhere. A long, drawn-out note, rising, falling, more melodic than before, almost like someone trying to imitate a tune, but getting the rhythm slightly wrong. I felt the hair on my arms lift as the sound wrapped around the clearing like a cold hand closing around my throat. It felt impossible, unnatural, as though the forest itself was amplifying it. I sat perfectly still, my breath shallow, my heartbeat pounding so loudly I was sure whatever was out there could hear it. Then, from behind me, another whistle. Different pitch, different direction. Something was circling me, not quickly, not clumsily, but with intention. Deliberate, measured, a hunter's patience. My mind raced through scenarios. Lost hikers, pranksters, someone drunk wandering through the woods, but none of them made sense. No one moves silently through dense brush at night. No one circles a stranger's camp without speaking, without stumbling, without a flashlight. And absolutely no one mimics two different whistle tones with such unnatural precision. I stood up slowly, my legs trembling despite my effort to steady them. I held my headlamp in front of me like a shield, sweeping its beam across the tree line. The light hit nothing but branches, leaves, empty shadows, but those shadows felt deeper than normal, darker than anything I'd ever encountered in these mountains. My voice cracked as I called out again, "Who's out there?" The forest held its breath. Then something answered, not in words, not in movement, but with one long, low exhale, so close behind me I felt the warmth of it touch the back of my neck. That breath on the back of my neck didn't feel imagined. It wasn't the wind shifting, and it wasn't the forest exhaling through the trees. It was warm. It was moist. It carried the faintest scent of soil and something sweet, almost metallic, and it rooted me in terror so complete that every instinct I had collapsed into a single primal command: don't turn around. Because something deep in me, something old and instinctive and buried in the marrow, believed that if I turned my head even an inch, I wouldn't walk out of that clearing alive. I don't know how long I stood there, frozen, feeling that breath linger against my skin. Seconds? Minutes? Time breaks when fear tightens around it. The fire had nearly died by then, just a few red pulses glowing like eyes at the base of the pit. Behind me, the forest shifted. Not a rustle, not a step, but a presence adjusting itself, the way a person might stand over your shoulder, curious to see what you'll do next. My headlamp trembled in my grip. I knew I had to move, but moving too fast could trigger whatever was stalking me. So I did the only thing that made sense. I closed my eyes, inhaled quietly, and stepped forward, away from the heat of that breath. The moment I moved, the night around me snapped. The insects, silent for so long, suddenly thrummed back to life as though someone had lifted a weight off the forest. But the relief didn't come, because as soon as I stepped forward, something behind me stepped too. One heavy stride, slow, unhurried, matching mine with terrifying precision. I turned then, not quickly but gradually, as if turning underwater. My headlamp cut a pale cone through the trees, but the moment my light moved, whatever had been standing behind me slipped left, out of my line of sight, with the speed and silence of something that knew these woods far better than I ever would. My heartbeat thundered in my ears. I backed toward the fire pit, searching for anything, any shape, any pair of eyes, but the forest was a solid wall of black. The only proof I had that something was there was the soft impression of movement and the cold certainty pulsing in my gut. I grabbed a burning stick from the fire pit, holding it like a crude torch. The embered end flared, sending a wave of sparks spiraling upward. The forest didn't like that. I felt it immediately, the way the night seemed to recoil, contracting deeper into the trees. For the first time since the whistling started, I felt a sliver of control. Not safety, never safety, but something close to the possibility of action. I swung the makeshift torch toward the dark, the flame tracing erratic arcs through the air. The heat brushed my face, the smell of charred wood coating my throat, but I didn't care. I just needed whatever was circling me to understand that I wasn't easy prey. My voice came out hoarse, shaking, but loud enough to cut through the night. "Stay back!" The woods answered with silence so total it pressed against my skull. And then, from somewhere deep between the trees, so far back, it felt almost taunting. A whistle. Not mocking, not rushed, just waiting. That broke something in me. Because it didn't sound confused or curious anymore. It sounded patient, intentional. And worst of all, it sounded like it had all the time in the world. I felt the edges of panic claw at my throat, but I knew panic would get me killed. I forced myself to think, to breathe, to move. I took a slow step toward my tent, then another, never turning my back fully to the forest. The thin nylon walls looked laughably fragile, but my map, my gear, my knife, everything I needed to survive the night was inside. The torch sputtered as I moved, shedding sparks that flickered like frightened fireflies. I tightened my grip, willing it to burn just a little longer. I ducked into the tent, never letting the flame leave the entrance. Once inside, I zipped the flap halfway, just enough to see out while shielding myself from the open clearing. My hands shook violently as I grabbed my knife and clipped my headlamp to the ceiling loop so it cast a low dome of light around the inside of the tent. The forest watched. I felt it. Every so often, the sound of leaves shifting drifted through the clearing, soft, methodical, never too close, never too far. As if whatever was out there was circling again, but slower this time, studying, figuring out what I would do next. I didn't sleep. I couldn't. I sat upright, knife in one hand, dimming torch in the other, staring through the half-open tent flap until the flame burned itself out completely, leaving behind nothing but the slope of cooling embers. The darkness pressed in again, and with the darkness came another sound, one that froze every muscle in my body. A voice, a low, broken whisper, far too close. Dan. E.L. My name, drawn out, distorted, like someone trying to speak through a damaged throat. My entire body locked. I gripped the knife so tightly the handle dug into my skin. My mind scrambled through every memory, every encounter, every explanation, but nothing made sense. No one knew I was here. No one followed me. No one should have known my name, unless they'd been listening, watching. From the moment I stepped into the woods, the voice came again, softer, struggling, as if learning the shape of my name. Dan, yell. My breath shook. My vision blurred. Every rule of wilderness safety I'd learned since childhood collapsed beneath a single horrifying truth. I wasn't dealing with a person. I didn't move. I didn't speak. I didn't breathe. For a long moment, the woods stayed completely still. Then, from just beyond the clearing, a new sound rose, a slow, deliberate scraping, as if something heavy was dragging itself across stone. Except there were no stones in that direction. Only leaves, only dirt, only forest. The scraping stopped, silence settled again, and then, in the far distance, so far it should have been comforting, but somehow wasn't, came one last whistle. Long, low, and strangely satisfied, as though whatever had been circling my camp had decided for tonight to leave me alive, but not alone, never alone, because when the dawn finally broke, soft and pale over the ridgeline, and I stepped outside my tent on shaking legs, the truth became clear. Not in the trees, not in the air, but on the ground. Just 20 feet from where I slept, pressed deep into the soft earth, was the unmistakable imprint of a bare human foot. Except the toes were wrong. Too long, too curved, too many joints. And next to that footprint, etched into the dirt with deliberate, childlike precision, was a single symbol, a circle, with a line running straight through it, as if it wanted me to know it had been there, as if it wanted me to remember, as if it planned to follow. I stared at that symbol until the edges of it blurred. The circle with the clean, straight line through the center didn't resemble any trail marker, any ranger insignia, any carving I had seen in all my years in the Appalachians. It felt wrong, too intentional, too personal, as if it had been left there not as a warning, but as a signature. The ground around the print was disturbed. The leaves shifted, the soil pressed down in a pattern that suggested someone had crouched there for a long time, maybe hours, just watching my tent. My stomach twisted as I knelt to study the marks. The footprint was human only in the broadest sense. The heel was shaped like ours, the ball of the foot too, but the arch bent inward sharply, unnaturally, and the toes curved like talons. No shoe prints, no sign of boots. No parallel impressions that suggested careful, deliberate footsteps leading away. Just that one print, as if it had stood there, and stood still. I backed away, the morning light suddenly too thin, too pale, useless against the heavy silence weighing over the clearing. The forest should have been alive by now. Songbirds calling, squirrels scrambling, the distant ramble of the river rolling over stone, but instead there was nothing. Not a single chirp. Not a single rustle, just the hiss of my own breath and the sudden awareness that something had disrupted the natural rhythm of the woods, something that did not belong. I forced myself to break camp with shaking hands, packing my tent and gear faster than I ever had in my life. Every time a branch snapped under my boots, I flinched. Every time a breeze brushed my neck, I felt the ghost of that warm breath from the night before. The whistle replayed in my head over and over, sharp, human-like, but not quite human at all. And that voice. My name stretched into something broken, as if the woods themselves had tried to speak it. By the time I stepped back onto the trail, the sun was beginning to filter through the canopy, brushing the trunks of the trees with soft gold. It should have brought relief. Instead, it only made the shadows seem sharper, deeper, as if something was waiting just behind them, matching my steps again like it had the night before. I kept my knife in my hand as I walked. Every few minutes I stopped and listened. No whistles, no voices. But the forest felt tight, pulled inward around me, as though it knew I was leaving, as though it didn't want me to. The descent down the ridge should have taken 2 hours. I did it in just over 1. But the more distance I put between myself and that campsite, the more the emotional conflict twisted inside me. Not fear, not exactly. Shame. Because a part of me felt like I was running, like I'd been tested, watched, studied, and then dismissed, as if whatever had stalked me had decided I wasn't worth the effort. That thought lodged itself deep, a thorn of humiliation I wasn't prepared for. I've been raised in these mountains, taught that the land judges everyone who steps into it. Some get welcomed, some get ignored, and a rare few get challenged. My father used to say, if the woods ever talk back, you best listen, but you better know they ain't doing it for your sake. I never understood what he meant until that morning, when I stopped halfway down the trail and felt it hit me for the first time. It wasn't just that something had followed me. It had chosen me, had watched me, learned me, called me by name, and then it let me go, not because I escaped, but because it wanted me to leave. The realization hollowed me. When I finally reached the trailhead parking lot, the world felt almost absurdly normal. Cars gleaming in the sunlight, a couple lacing their boots near the map board, a ranger sitting in his truck, sipping coffee. The contrast made me dizzy. I must have looked pale because the ranger stepped out and asked if I was all right. I hesitated. What was I supposed to say? That something non-human had broken the silence of the Shenandoah night to mimic my name? That unseen steps had circled my tent? That I'd woken to a footprint shaped like a human that had never been human at all? So I told him the only part that sounded sane. I heard whistles out there, I said quietly. Someone was following me. He studied me with calm, steady eyes, the kind rangers develop after decades of hearing impossible stories whispered by hikers who returned shaken and pale. Stories they're expected to treat with professionalism, not judgment. Whistles, he repeated. More than once? 4 times, I said. He stared out at the tree line then, his jaw tightening, his eyes narrowing just slightly. Not in disbelief, but in recognition. You camped near Hughes River? He asked. My mouth went dry. Yeah, he nodded slowly. We get reports from that area sometimes. Strange calls, voices, things echoing that shouldn't echo. He looked at me, his tone lowering. Next time, don't camp there alone. There was no sarcasm in his voice, no attempt to reassure me, just a quiet, heavy truth that landed like a stone in my gut. I opened my mouth, closed it, opened it again. Do you know what it is? The ranger didn't answer immediately. His eyes stayed fixed on the woods, as though he expected something to step out from between the trunks. When he finally spoke, his voice was almost a whisper. Not everything in these mountains wants to be understood. And then he turned and walked back to his truck, leaving me standing there with my pulse still thundering, and the realization that he hadn't said no. He hadn't denied anything. He hadn't dismissed a single word. He knew something. He just refused to name it. In the days after I returned home, the woods stayed with me in ways I couldn't shake. The whistles echoed in my dreams. The voice, my name stretched like a question, slipped into the quietest moments of my day. Sometimes I'd wake before dawn and swear I heard breathing just outside my bedroom window, even though no one was there. And worst of all, every time I closed my eyes, I could see that footprint in the soil, toes too long, arch too sharp, the circle and line carved into the dirt like a promise or a claim. I told myself I wouldn't go back, that I'd stay away from Shenandoah for a long time. But the mountains have a pull, a gravity that tugs at people who grow up in their shadow. Weeks passed, then months, and the fear didn't fade. It changed, hardened, became something like curiosity and something like unfinished business. Because even though everything in me said to let that night go, a deeper part of me, something instinctual, something born of these hills and ridges, kept whispering the same question over and over. If it wanted to hurt me, why didn't it? Why did it learn my name? Why did it circle me? Why did it mark the ground? And what did that symbol mean? I didn't have answers, but I knew one thing for certain. Whatever stalked me that night wasn't done. Not with the woods, not with the ridges, and not with me. Weeks later, after the worst of the fear had simmered into something quieter, something colder, I found myself standing at the edge of my backyard one evening, staring into the tree line as the daylight thinned. The woods behind my house weren't vast like Shenandoah, but they were deep enough to breathe with their own rhythm, to hold shadows that moved slower than the sun. I told myself I was only out there to clear my head, to let the evening settle me the way it always had. But a part of me knew the truth. I was listening for something I hoped I wouldn't hear, listening for something I feared I had already invited. A breeze drifted through the leaves, carrying the scent of damp soil and honeysuckle. For a moment, everything felt normal, peaceful. But then, just as I turned to head back inside, I heard it. Not a whistle, not a step, not my name, but breathing, soft, measured, slow, Coming from the darkness between the trees, I froze, every nerve in my body tightening like a pulled snare. I knew that sound, not from a person, not from any animal that belonged in these woods. It was the same breathing I'd heard in the clearing, the same warm exhale that had brushed the back of my neck. My pulse thudded violently as I stepped backward toward the safety of the house. The breathing didn't follow. It didn't grow closer. It simply existed, as if whatever was hidden in the trees wasn't approaching me, just reminding me it was there, reminding me it still knew where to find me. That night, sleep stayed far from me. Every creak in the walls, every settling groan of wood sounded like footsteps just outside my window. I kept the lamp on until sunrise, gripping the edge of the blanket with white-knuckled tension. The woods had followed me home, not in body, but in presence, in awareness. Something in those ridges had learned me, remembered me, and had no intention of letting me forget it existed. I tried everything to push it from my mind, work, noise, company, but every distraction only stretched thin over the memory of those whistles, and over the growing certainty that something in Shenandoah had marked me, claimed me, watched me walk away, and decided it wasn't finished. The symbol haunted me most of all. A circle, with a line straight through it. Simple, primitive, purposeful. I searched for explanations, old indigenous symbols, surveyor marks, hobo signs, trail codes. Nothing matched, nothing even came close. And the more I looked, the more I felt that sickening sensation crawl up my spine. The symbol wasn't meant to be recognized. It was meant to be understood only by the thing that made it, by the thing that left it for me to find. One late night, months after the encounter, I found myself driving without planning to, without deciding to, back toward the Blue Ridge. My mind was fogged, my focus drifting, guided by something deeper than logic. I didn't turn into the park. I didn't stop at a trailhead. I just drove the long, winding roads beneath those mountains, the dark mass of the ridges rising against the sky like sleeping giants. And as I drove, I realized something unsettling. I wasn't running from that night anymore. Not from the whistles. Not from the voice. Not from the presence that had circled my tent. I was drawn to it. Not because I wanted danger, not because I sought fear, but because some encounters in the wilderness change you in ways that don't fade. They embed themselves beneath the skin, deep in the marrow, where instinct and memory blur. And once something ancient in those forests chooses you, the mountains never let you go entirely. I pulled off at an overlook, stepping out into the cool night air. Below me, the valleys stretched like dark rivers, the trees rising in waves that disappeared into the horizon. The silence was absolute, a peaceful night to anyone else. But I felt it, the same way you feel someone staring at you across a crowded room. A presence, a weight, a watchfulness. Somewhere in that endless sea of trees, something was standing in the darkness, still and patient, waiting the way it had waited outside my tent, waiting the way it had waited at the edge of my yard, waiting for me to return. I swallowed hard, the cold wind biting at my cheeks, and whispered into the night, "What do you want?" My voice dissolved into the vastness, carried away by the mountain air. For a long moment there was nothing. Then, soft, faint, faint. So distant I almost believed I imagined it. A whistle. Not threatening, not mocking, just acknowledging. As if answering a question I didn't know how to ask. As if confirming what I had feared all along. As if promising that the story between us wasn't over. I stood there a long time, the wind wrapping around me, the whistle fading into the ridgelines, not in terror, not anymore, but in a strange, unsettling understanding that I had brushed against something older than these mountains, something that moved in the spaces between human footsteps, something that could mimic us but was not one of us, something that didn't follow hikers for hunger, something that didn't stalk for sport, something that marked the ones it chose to watch. And I had been chosen. I don't tell this story to frighten campers away from Shenandoah or to warn hikers off the ridge trails. I tell it because sometimes the wilderness speaks, and on rare, unforgettable nights, it speaks back. And when it does, you learn quickly that not every shadow is empty, not every voice is human, and not every whistle is a harmless sound echoing through the trees. Some whistles are invitations, some are warnings, and some, the ones that follow you home, are promises. Because the woods remember, the mountains remember, and whatever walked the ridges that night, it remembers me too. I had never believed in the stories people whispered around campfires, the tales that curled like smoke into the night air, leaving an uneasy chill in your chest. But the night I met the stranger at my campsite in Big Bend National Park, every instinct I had about isolation, the wilderness, and the unseen shadows in the desert proved to be not only true, but terrifying in ways I could never have imagined. My name is Daniel. I was 29 at the time, and I had always sought the solitude of the wild as a kind of refuge, a place where the constant noise of life could not reach me. Big Bend had always been a favorite. The vast emptiness of the Chisos Mountains, the whispering winds through the canyons, the stark contrast of the desert night sky speckled with stars. This was where I felt most alive. Yet, that March in 2021, the desert taught me that being alone does not always mean being safe. I arrived mid-afternoon, the sun low enough to cast long shadows across the red clay soil, yet warm enough to burn my arms as I carried my pack along the narrow trail that led to my chosen campsite near the Rio Grande. The locals had warned me of the early spring winds and the occasional unexpected visitor, strangers who wandered far from the park roads. I laughed it off, thinking of it as small-town superstition, a story told by rangers to keep night wanderers cautious. But even as I set up my tent, there was a subtle shift in the atmosphere, a quiet tension that settled into the brush and rocks around me, as if the land itself was holding its breath. By the time the sun dipped below the jagged horizon, painting the sky in strokes of crimson and gold, I had a small fire going, a thin wisp of smoke curling into the cool evening air. I had unpacked my small gear meticulously, the sleeping bag, the lantern, the thermos of coffee, and my notebook where I chronicled my trips. Everything was as it should be, and yet the desert had changed. There was a sound, a faint rustling like footsteps on dry leaves, but no wind, no animals. My pulse quickened and I paused, listening. The wind whispered again through the canyons, but that subtle, irregular crunch persisted, moving closer to the clearing where I had pitched my tent. And then he appeared. At first, I thought he was another camper. His clothes were dark, almost blending with the shadows of the desert, and his face was partially obscured by a wide-brimmed hat. He carried nothing, no backpack, no visible tools, nothing to suggest he had been on the trail. He simply stood there, motionless, observing. I called out, asking if he needed assistance or a place to camp, but he only tilted his head slightly, a gesture that was both curious and unsettling. The air thickened. I felt a strange compulsion to retreat into my tent, to shut the world away, but my feet felt rooted to the ground, my eyes locked on the silhouette framed against the dying light. Minutes passed, or perhaps hours, the desert's silence stretching time into something slippery and ungraspable. Then, in a voice that was softer than the wind, he spoke, not directly to me, but as if the words were intended for the night itself. "It's not safe here," he said. There was no malice in the tone, yet every fiber of my being screamed that something was wrong. I asked him what he meant, but he only shook his head, the brim of his hat shadowing his features further. And then, almost imperceptibly, he began to walk backward into the darkness, his steps soundless, swallowed by the night. I blinked, thinking I had misperceived it, but when I looked again, he was gone. The place where he had stood was empty. There was no trace, no footprints, no disturbed earth, nothing. The rest of the night was a restless blur. Every snap of a branch, every howl of a coyote, every whisper of wind through the mesquite trees set my nerves on fire. I kept checking the perimeter of my campsite, flashlights sweeping the desert floor, but the stranger had vanished. Sleep came in broken intervals, haunted by the shadow of his presence, by the feeling that I was being watched, even when I was alone. By dawn, I had packed up quickly, driven by an instinctual need to leave, though the rational part of me told me it was just a man passing through. Yet, as I hiked down the trail, I realized that the silence had returned in a way that was almost deafening, as if the desert itself had exhaled, keeping a secret that it would never tell. The weeks after that trip, I wrestled with my memory of him. Friends laughed when I recounted the story, dismissing it as imagination or exhaustion. But I knew what I had seen. I had camped in Big Bend many times before, but never had I felt such an oppressive, inexplicable presence. It wasn't fear of danger in the traditional sense. The stranger carried no weapon, no threatening stance, but it was the awareness of something entirely outside the natural order, something that existed on the boundary between reality and the unknown. I learned to respect the desert in a way I hadn't before, to understand that solitude comes with a price, that the land itself can harbor watchers, guides, and unspoken warnings that demand attention. I returned to that campsite the following year, with friends this time, cameras, and a sense of rationality to ground me. But the memory of that vanishing visitor lingered, etched into the crevices of my mind like the lines in the canyons themselves. We hiked, we explored, and though I laughed and shared stories, I could not shake the sensation that eyes followed us, even when we were surrounded by the warmth of daylight. In that moment, I realized that fear in the wilderness is not always about survival. It is about humility, the understanding that the world is far larger, far older, and far stranger than we allow ourselves to imagine. And so I share this story not to frighten, but to illuminate. To those who venture into the woods alone, who seek solace in the mountains, or who wander the trails in the quiet of the night, know this. The world beyond the trailhead is alive, and sometimes it speaks in ways that defy explanation. The stranger at my campsite was not a threat in the conventional sense. He was a reminder that the wilderness has its own rhythms, its own logic, and its own watchers. The fear that lingers after such an encounter is not to be dismissed. It is the voice of the wild, whispering lessons that we may never fully comprehend, lessons about presence, awareness, and the delicate balance between courage and recklessness. Even now, years later, I find myself returning in thought to that night, to the fleeting silhouette of a man who was there and then gone, like a mirage in the desert. I remember the way the air carried his words, the subtle weight of his gaze, and the quiet reminder that the wilderness is never truly empty. Each trip into the backcountry carries the potential for wonder and terror alike, and it is up to us to navigate it with respect, humility, and the awareness that sometimes the most profound encounters are those we cannot explain, those that leave an indelible mark on our souls, and those that teach us lessons about life, fear, and the mysteries that inhabit the spaces between the stars and the canyons of the desert. Even as I left the canyon behind, walking the dusty trails toward the park exit, I felt that invisible tether, as if the desert itself had attached something of its essence to me. Days later, in the quiet hum of my apartment, I would catch myself imagining a shadow moving just beyond the curtain of my window, or a whisper in the wind that wasn't really wind at all. It was subtle at first, a sense of unease that I could almost rationalize, but over time, it grew, shaping the way I thought about isolation, about being alone in a world that seems empty, yet is never truly uninhabited. There is a delicate terror in knowing that there are things in the wilderness that see you, that measure your every step, that exist entirely outside the boundaries of reason or explanation. That night in Big Bend, the desert taught me that true fear is not the fear of being attacked, but the fear of being witnessed, of being weighed against a reality you cannot understand. I often returned in my memory to the way the stranger had looked, or more accurately, the way he had not looked. His features were indistinct, swallowed by shadow, yet there was a weight in his presence, a gravity that pressed against the edges of my awareness. And then, of course, there was the way he had vanished, leaving no trace, no footprints, nothing to mark the place where he had been. That absence was heavier than any presence I had ever felt. I realized that fear is not always about what appears before you. Sometimes it is about what lingers after it is gone. In the silence that followed, in the emptiness of the campsite where I had believed I was alone, I learned the true meaning of vigilance, not merely for safety, but for respect, for comprehension of a world that does not conform to human expectation. Months passed, and the story of that night became something I shared sparingly, mostly with hikers and campers who had themselves wandered into the vast uncharted backcountry of the American West. Few believed me, and yet, each time I recounted the tale, I noticed the same shift in their posture, the tightening of the jaw, the quickening of their gaze toward the shadows just beyond the firelight. It is impossible to articulate the feeling of being in the presence of something that defies classification. The stranger was not a man, not a myth, not a trick of the mind, but something that occupied a space between all of these. He forced me to confront a primal understanding that the world is not made solely for us, and that the wilderness retains its sovereignty, even over those of us who believe we are explorers, masters of trails and paths. I returned to Big Bend a year later with a small group, friends who shared my fascination with remote landscapes and the unknown, carrying a sense of safety in numbers. Yet, even in their presence, I felt the pulse of that night in March, the lingering echo of the stranger's warning. The desert does not forgive arrogance, and it does not allow hubris to go untested. We hiked the same trail, camped at a distance, laughed, and spoke in low voices. Yet the wind shifted differently. The shadows stretched longer, and the silence between our words felt thick with unseen eyes. I realized then that the wilderness has its own narrative, a story that unfolds regardless of our presence, and sometimes it chooses to reveal itself to those who are both willing and unprepared, who venture far enough to earn its attention and wise enough to recognize the lesson when it comes. On the last night of that trip, as my friends slept under the dim glow of lanterns, I wandered the ridge above our campsite, staring into the vast expanse of the Chihuahuan Desert. The moon had risen, casting silver light over the jagged mountains and flatlands, turning familiar terrain into an otherworldly landscape. That is when I felt it again. The subtle shift in the air, a presence at the edge of perception, a figure just beyond the reach of vision. My heart hammered, but there was no panic, only recognition. He was there, or something like him, standing at the boundary where the desert folds into shadow, as if acknowledging my return. I did not speak, I did not call out. I only watched, feeling a mixture of fear, awe, and respect, until the first rays of dawn touched the horizon, and he, or whatever it was, simply dissolved into the morning light, leaving me with the echo of a warning, a reminder, and a lesson I would carry for the rest of my life. That encounter, brief as it was, changed the way I approached the wilderness and life itself. I began to understand that fear is not something to conquer, but something to navigate. That respect is more potent than arrogance. That solitude in the backcountry is a dialogue, not a monologue. The stranger did not harm me. He did not speak threats. Yet he left me with something far more enduring, a recognition of the unknown, a reminder that the world is layered, complex, and far beyond our comprehension. And perhaps in that lesson, there is a kind of beauty, a kind of sacred terror that humbles the mind and expands the soul simultaneously. Even now, when I plan a solo camping trip or hike into the depths of an unfamiliar park, I carry that memory. Every rustle in the leaves, every shift in shadow, every echo in the canyon floor reminds me that I am part of a world far larger than myself. I am never truly alone, and neither are you when you wander into the deep woods. The wilderness is a mirror, reflecting not only what we bring into it, but also what it chooses to reveal to us. The stranger at my campsite was a reflection of that truth, a figure that existed not to frighten, but to teach, to confront, and to remind. In the quiet hours before sunrise, as I closed my eyes under the canvas of my tent, listening to the subtle sigh of wind over rocks and desert flora, I remember his words, soft, almost carried on the wind. It's not safe here. and I understand them differently now. Safety is not merely the absence of danger, it is the presence of respect, the awareness of boundaries, and the humility to recognize that we occupy only a small fraction of a world that is vast, ancient, and alive with mysteries. That night in Big Bend taught me more about myself than any city, any friend, any book ever could. It taught me that fear, when tempered with observation and respect, becomes a guide, a teacher, a guardian in the shadows, and that sometimes the lessons we cannot explain are the ones that shape us most profoundly. And so I leave you with this, not as a warning, not as a tale to frighten, but as a truth to carry with you into the backcountry, into the darkened trails, into the quiet spaces of your own life. The wilderness is alive. It watches. It teaches. And every so often, in the fleeting silhouette of a stranger who vanishes as if into air, it reminds us of our own smallness, our own vulnerability, and the sacred awe of being alive in a world that exists beyond the limits of our understanding. The wind cut through the trees like a serrated blade, carrying with it a cold so sharp it made your bones ache. The kind of cold that felt alive, creeping into every inch of your skin until you could swear the forest itself was breathing through you. My name is Ethan. I was 29 at the time, and I had always chased the kind of silence you only find in places untouched, unclaimed, where the world seems to have forgotten to shine a light. I grew up hearing stories from locals in Fairbanks about the park, their warnings half folklore, half cautionary tales. Don't follow tracks that seem too fresh, one old trapper told me, because some things walk these woods that aren't meant to be found. At the time, I thought of it as colorful advice meant to thrill tourists. But by the time I set foot in Denali National Park that January morning, the full weight of that warning pressed into my chest, suffocating and real. The first days were deceptively calm. I set up my camp at the base of a ridge I'd been told offered the clearest view of the frozen expanse, my tent pitched in the thin layer of snow that clung stubbornly to the ground. The mountains around me loomed like silent sentinels, pale and monolithic, and at first, it was everything I had come to the wilderness for. The purity of isolation, the hypnotic crunch of snow beneath boots, the way the sun scattered shards of light across icy streams. But even in that quiet, I felt the subtle rhythm of the park's heartbeat, the faint rustle of unseen wildlife, the soft groan of ice under the weight of the wind, the way shadows seemed to stretch longer than the sun's logic allowed. There was something that made me feel watched, though I saw nothing but snow and jagged rock, and I ignored it as a product of solitude. It was on the third night that the tracks appeared. I had returned from a short trek to collect firewood, my headlamp cutting a narrow path through the dark. When I stumbled across them, deep, singular footprints in the fresh snow, I froze. They were human, though unnaturally large and perfectly spaced as if the person, or whatever it was, walked with an eerie, deliberate calm. The prints began just beyond my camp and led deeper into the woods, then abruptly stopped. It was the stopping that unnerved me most, like the world had taken a breath and held it. Part of me screamed to follow them, to see what had made these marks, and part of me screamed louder to run, to pack and leave before whatever had been here returned. I didn't move for what felt like hours, the wind growing sharper, snatching at my tent like hands trying to pry me away. By the next morning, my curiosity had won over fear. I set out to trace the tracks, layering on fleece and parka until I felt like a walking fortress against the cold. With each step, I noticed details I would have otherwise overlooked. The sudden stoppers in the snow, the subtle disturbance of tree branches, the way the frost clung in strange patterns on the bark as if painting a warning. The deeper I went, the more I felt a presence just at the edge of my senses, something that watched me not with eyes, but with intention. There is a strange terror in realizing you are alone, yet not alone. The forest's quiet seems to pulse with the weight of its own life. And then I saw it. The tracks led to a clearing, perfectly circular, snow packed hard as if something large had been there, but the snow was otherwise untouched. No trees knocked down, no sign of a struggle, yet an oppressive emptiness pressed into my chest. A void that made me stumble backward, gasping. I spent that day in near paralysis, pacing the rim of the clearing, trying to rationalize what I saw. Could it have been an animal? Bears leave tracks, wolves, even moose, but these were too precise, too deliberate, and the emptiness where they ended suggested something different. Night came faster than I wanted, and I returned to camp with a mind teetering between fascination and dread. That night, sleep was impossible. I lay in my tent, listening to the wind and to something else, the faintest, most deliberate crunch of snow in the distance. I told myself it was the wind, a branch shifting, but deep down, I knew the rhythm was too intentional, too steady to be random. It moved closer over the hours, pausing just beyond my small fire's glow. I felt its presence like a weight on the edge of my consciousness, a silent challenge. Every instinct screamed to leave, yet I remained, frozen by the curiosity that had brought me here in the first place. The following day, I decided to move camp to put distance between myself and that clearing. As I broke down the tent and packed my gear, I noticed a new set of tracks circling around my previous campsite. They didn't lead away. They lingered, like something had been pacing, observing, waiting. My stomach turned with a combination of fear and disbelief. I had to accept that I wasn't merely encountering wildlife. I was dealing with something that did not belong to the realm I understood. And yet, the rational part of me still fought the idea of leaving the park prematurely. I began hiking toward lower elevation, hoping the thick trees and denser terrain would mask me from whatever had been trailing me. Every footfall felt loud, deliberate in my own ears, and every shadow seemed to shift when I glanced away. It wasn't until late afternoon, when the sun barely rose above the horizon, that I encountered the first real terror of the trip. I crossed a narrow, frozen stream, careful with each step, when I looked up to see footprints crossing directly ahead of me on the ice. Fresh, perfectly formed, leading straight to me from the ridge above, though no one could have possibly come from that direction without descending from cliffs sheer enough to defy climbing. My breath caught, and for the first time, panic surged through me. The tracks stopped abruptly, less than 10 feet from where I stood, leaving nothing but empty ice. My heart raced, my fingers trembling, and I realized that these tracks, these frozen echoes of movement, weren't just a record. They were a warning. Something had been here. Something had watched me. And it had stopped because I had arrived. As twilight turned to near darkness, I made the decision I should have made from the beginning. I moved quickly, retracing my route to safer ground, using every skill I had learned as a camper, hiker, and survivor. The wind seemed to follow me, carrying whispers that could have been nothing or everything. My mind played tricks, conjuring shapes in the trees, shadows that moved too fluidly, sounds too intentional. I forced myself to keep walking, ignoring the shivers crawling down my spine. Each time I paused, a crunch would echo from behind, sometimes near, sometimes impossibly far. It was a psychological torment, an invisible opponent that tested my resolve and my courage. I realized the forest itself was alive with secrets, with warnings, with forces beyond comprehension, and that the bravest thing I could do was to acknowledge my limits without surrendering to them. By the time I reached the relative safety of a ranger station 2 miles off trail, my body shook with exhaustion, my hands numb, my mind replaying every footstep, every whisper, every frozen imprint in the snow. I shared the story with the ranger on duty, expecting disbelief, perhaps a knowing nod of folklore. Instead, he simply said, "Tracks like that, they aren't uncommon here, but they never lead where they should." The words chilled me more than the cold. They confirmed the unspoken. Denali held a mystery beyond survival, a challenge not of body but of psyche. I left that park with more than memories. I left with an understanding that fear is not always born of what we see, but of what we cannot explain. And sometimes survival is measured not by the trails we follow, but by the courage to step away from the ones we do not. Glowing eyes pierced the darkness like twin embers suspended in the night, watching me from somewhere deep in the forest where the wind whispered secrets only the mountains understood. My name is Alex Harper. I'm 32, and I've spent most of my life chasing the quiet solitude of the Appalachian woods, seeking the kind of peace that comes only when you're far from the hum of civilization. But that August night in Grand Teton National Park, Wyoming, I discovered something else entirely, an understanding that nature holds shadows as much as it holds light, and sometimes those shadows are awake. I had set out alone, drawn by the grandeur of the jagged peaks and the crystal reflection of the Snake River, seeking a campsite tucked away from the well-trodden paths, the kind where only a few locals dared wander. The air carried a crispness that hinted at autumn, even in midsummer, and the pine needles underfoot were damp, giving every step a muffled, careful rhythm. I had been hiking since noon, tracing ridgelines and secret valleys I had memorized from maps and old stories, whispered by Wyoming ranchers who claimed the mountains were alive in ways you could neither see nor explain. By dusk, I had found a clearing that seemed untouched by human hands. A circle of stones hinted at past campers, perhaps hunters or wanderers like me, and I pitched my tent with the precision of habit, aware of the isolation around me. As I settled in, the sun dipped behind the peaks, painting the world in bruised purples and fiery oranges. I built a small fire, the kind that radiates warmth and yet feels too fragile against the vast dark beyond. It was then that the first sense of unease crept in, not through sound, but through silence. The usual forest orchestra, the chirping crickets, the rustling leaves, faded into something expectant, like the world was holding its breath. I chalked it up to the thrill of solitude, the mind's natural tendency to color shadows with stories. But when movement flickered at the edge of my vision, subtle and deliberate, I realized this was no ordinary wildlife. A pair of glowing eyes appeared first, low and level with the forest floor, reflecting the last embers of my fire. They didn't blink, didn't move erratically like a deer or coyote might. They just watched. My pulse tightened, a drumbeat against my ribs, and instinct screamed at me to flee, yet my body remained anchored to the ground. I whispered into the night, unsure whether the sound was meant for the creature or myself. The eyes remained, and then, slowly, others joined them, emerging from the blackness like silent sentinels. Each step they took was careful, deliberate, not threatening in the usual sense, yet profoundly unsettling, as if the forest itself was aware of my presence and had summoned something I wasn't meant to meet. I clutched my flashlight and swung it across the trees, the beam catching glimpses of figures that seemed more shadow than flesh, elongated limbs blending into the trunks, movements that defied natural rhythm. My mind raced for rational explanations, maybe a hunter with reflective gear, maybe elk eyes catching the firelight, maybe a trick of perspective and exhaustion. But deep down, I knew this wasn't just a trick. I had survived countless nights in isolated campsites across the Appalachians, navigated storms in the Smokies, and wandered abandoned cabins in the Blue Ridge, but this felt different. The weight of the silence pressed in, punctuated only by the low crunch of pine needles under those careful, unnatural steps. I could feel the heat of my own fear, sharp and unwelcome. And yet there was a magnetic pull. I couldn't simply leave, not yet. Some part of me wanted to understand, to witness, to grasp the reality that my logical mind refused to acknowledge. Hours passed, or perhaps minutes, though time seemed suspended in the dark. I tried small gestures, tossing a twig to gauge reaction, shifting my flashlight, humming quietly to myself. The shadows responded with movement, but never directly, never fully revealing themselves. Every sound I made felt amplified. Every leaf rustle could have been a warning. Hunger and fatigue were no match for the primal vigilance that gripped me. I recalled stories from local guides, tales of mountain spirits, of hunters who never returned, of glowing eyes in the tree line that were said to judge those who dared venture too far alone. I had always thought these were folktales, romanticized warnings meant to thrill tourists, But the weight of unseen eyes, the sensation of being measured in silence, stripped away every layer of skepticism. I realized slowly that my only option was stillness, absolute, deliberate stillness. To move would invite attention, and yet remaining frozen was its own torment. My breathing became a rhythm I counted, a fragile tether to sanity. I remembered the advice of an old backcountry mentor. When the forest watches, don't confront it. Respect it, and it might let you leave. I whispered a quiet apology into the night, not to any particular entity, but as a promise that I would tread carefully, honor the space I had intruded upon. Gradually, the glowing eyes receded into the darkness, dissolving into shapes and shadows until the forest returned to its normal symphony of sounds, as if whatever presence had tested me had decided I was no threat, or that I had earned the right to leave. Dawn arrived with hesitant light filtering through the jagged silhouettes of the Tetons. The night's terror still clung to my skin, an invisible weight that made every branch, every rock feel charged with memory. I packed my campsite slowly, observing every detail as if the forest itself might be watching my farewell. On the trail back to the main path, I noticed subtle signs that confirmed my unease. Trampled underbrush in patterns too deliberate for animals, like stones moved from their natural positions, a faint musky scent that lingered in the air. I realized that fear wasn't merely about danger. It was a form of respect, an acknowledgement that wilderness was not just a backdrop for human adventure, but a living, breathing entity with its own rules, its own sentience. By the time I reached my car, parked under the watchful peaks, the adrenaline had faded, leaving a quiet reverence. I wasn't triumphant. I wasn't exhilarated in the conventional sense. I was changed, aware that the wilderness could be intimate, terrifying, and sacred all at once. That night in Grand Teton National Park taught me that survival is not always about confrontation or endurance. It's about perception, humility, and the willingness to yield to forces larger than oneself. The forest doesn't apologize for its shadows, and the night doesn't forgive carelessness, but there is an extraordinary beauty in recognizing that balance between fear and respect. Even now, years later, I remember the glow of those eyes, the slow, deliberate steps, the silence that spoke louder than any scream. And every time I return to the mountains, whether in Appalachia or Wyoming, I carry that memory like a compass, reminding me that fear can be a teacher, terror can be transformative, and the wilderness always has stories that outlast human understanding.